Welcome everyone to this session on journalism, reporting and emergencies. Great to have you with us. I'm joined today by Stephanie Corsetti from SBS and by Rebecca Hersher from NPR in the US. Stephanie started her media career in community radio in 2007 and she then became a traffic reporter and producer at ABC Radio Melbourne, working on the award-winning morning show with John Fane. Stephanie shifted to the ABC newsroom after completing her cadetship in 2011 and she completed a stint with the radio current affairs team in Melbourne, filing national stories for the AM and the World Today and PM in 2017. She's shortlisted for a Melbourne Press Club Quill Award in 2016 in the regional category for domestic violence reporting. She's also worked in the Bendigo and Mildura ABC offices in regional Victoria and done a short-term stint at Horsham during the Grampians fires and the Sydney newsroom in 2017. At the ABC, Stephanie won Best TV News Story at the Rural Press Club of Victoria Awards in 2019 and scored the Victorian Multicultural Commission Media Award in 2020 for SBS, where she now works. Both awards were for her coverage of failings in the family violence system. So it's wonderful to have you here with us today, Stephanie. Welcome. We're also joined by Rebecca. Rebecca is a reporter on NPR's Science Desk, based in DC, where she reports on outbreaks, natural disasters, and environmental and health research. Since coming to NPR in 2011, she's covered the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, embedded with the Afghan army after the American combat mission ended, and reported on floods and hurricanes in the US. She's also reported on research about puppies. Before her work on the Science Desk, she was a producer for NPR's Weekend Orphans Considered in Los Angeles. Hersher was part of the NPR team that won a Peabody Award for coverage of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and produced a story from Liberia that won an Edward R. Murrow Award for use of sound. She's a finalist for the 2017 Daniel Shaw Prize and 2017 Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting Fellow, reporting on sanitisation in Haiti, and a 2015 NPR Above the Fray Fellow investigating the causes of a suicide epidemic in Greenland. So, esteemed company, we're really lucky to have both of you here today to talk more about reporting, journalism and emergencies. I just want to start quickly after that intro by acknowledging country. We're doing this obviously digitally, but we all still have our feet on the ground somewhere. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the Kulin Nations, to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And I might just throw to each of you to let us know where you're coming from.
Well,
Steph, do you want to start?
Sure, like you, Rebecca, same country, Wurundjeri country, and I'd also like to acknowledge elders past and present and the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne, Kulin Nation.
Thanks.
And I'm all the way over in the Washington, D.C. region, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples who's their traditional homeland.
Great. Well, we've got an hour together today, so I've got heaps of questions. For a little bit of context, I'm Naomi Bailey. I've been working with the Gender and Disaster Pod for 5, 6, 7 years now, and I wrote the outcome statement for the last Diversity and Disaster Conference, at which we had a panel on reporting disasters that was really wonderful. We're keen to really explore some of those themes that came up. But I thought we might just start with hearing a little bit from each of you on how you began reporting on disasters and emergencies. Steph, what brought you into reporting in this space?
When I started my professional journalism career, it was actually around the Black Saturday bushfires, which happened in 2009 in Victoria. And one of the very first jobs I did on air was broadcast for the Kinglake Radio, which was set up by the ABC in the aftermath of the fires. So that was directly for the community to help them. It was community announcements that I read out for people needing any support and help. And I was very green and hadn't been on air very long. And that was a great opportunity to see what the ABC was doing at that time when I worked there, and just see how they could really help galvanise support and get people, helping them in their recovery. So I did that first off, and like you said in my intro, covered some of the Grampians fires. I went out to that a few years later, and that was in a lot of national parkland. And of course, moving on, you know, we've had floods here recently, and I've covered that more remotely for SBS, but as you know, bushfires is just such a big issue for Australia, and we had the terrible Black Summer fires recently as well. So I was working New Year's Day last year when that was really taking off, and that was very severe for so many communities.
And Steph, am I right in thinking that you spent quite a bit of time in rural reporting, and that those issues are quite close to the communities that you worked in?
Yes, so I've worked in Bendigo in central Victoria and covered anniversary events for the Black Saturday fires, because they also had a couple of deaths there, and they had houses lost. So interviewing families only just a few years ago, when I think it must have been the 10-year anniversary in 2019. And you know, you can still see the traumas there for them, and they had a very moving ceremony at a memorial that was built there in Bendigo. So yes, the issues are very close to people in central Victoria, where I worked for several years for the ABC.
And Rebecca, how did you come to be reporting on emergencies and disasters?
Well, it's an interesting question to ask, because I think in some ways the only path for young journalists in the US is through emergencies of some kind, whether it's weather emergencies. You know, the US is a very large, very populous country, and if you're trying to break into journalism, you basically will be asked to cover a wildfire, a flood, a heat wave, a hurricane, or that most American of emergencies, a mass shooting. And I covered all those things when I first started out, because that's ever present in this country. And so you almost can't become a reporter here without sort of being thrown into a community that's having its worst day and being asked to talk to people who are having their worst days of their lives. And it makes you think about, you know, what's the best way to do that. Go ahead.
Sorry. We're going to have a bit of that,
I'm interested to know. Yeah, no, I'm interested to know what you were going to say.
I'm glad we got it out of the way early.
Yeah.
I do want to return to that theme of interviewing and what that's like. But I wondered if we could focus in just a little bit on each of your own experiences there. And, you know, I'd love to hear from you what you think your role is as a reporter who's going into an emergency context. What do you think your role is as a reporter? And I think this is I might go to you first, Rebecca. I'd love to hear your reflections on perhaps how that changed over time, going in as a first-time journalist as opposed to going into someone who's now quite seasoned, as opposed to going in as someone who's now quite seasoned in reporting on emergencies.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And my understanding of my own role has definitely changed over time. You know, I think at the beginning, it feels very overwhelming to know that you're in a space where people are suffering, and that you are there not because you're suffering, but because you're working. And I think that at first I held myself at a remove from the situation that I was part of. But the reality is that you're part of it. And I think now I see myself more as somebody who's balancing, you know, my role as a witness and as a person who's sharing information and getting information out with my role. You know, there are ethical demands to being a human, and those don't just go away because you're working. So just little things like, you know, my preparation before hurricanes. I cover a lot of hurricanes now as well as wildfires. And before hurricane season, I have a to-go area in my house. And that used to include everything I needed. And now it includes some other stuff that I should always be carrying to help other people. full? You know, how much water do you carry? Will you carry enough for yourself and others? You know, how do you organize the information you get? Do you organize it such that you can report it? Or do you also organize it in a way where you can share it with the people you interview so that you can share bureaucratic information, share resources in that moment? They shouldn't have to listen to your report later to get the information that you're sharing. So little things like that, organizing your notebook in a way where you can convey information to people that you interview rather than just extracting information from them. I think that can be a posture that really changes the way that you interact with people that you're interviewing.
What about you, Steph? What do you think the role is, or your role is, and has that changed over time for you?
I'd say the role when you're going to a disaster scene is for reporters, you're getting that access on the fire ground or different places where the general public can't go. So as the media, you're getting that opportunity to go there and firsthand see what's gone on, the aftermath and the scene. So you've got that duty and that responsibility to convey that to the general public and to the audience who can't observe what you're seeing. And like Rebecca said, you've still got that ethical sense where you need to really assess people and see, are they traumatized? Are they fit to be interviewed? Think about their welfare. And you may need to make a call as a reporter and decide, well, no, actually they're not quite up for the interview because they might be highly stressed and you've got just so many things to think about. So yeah, I think that's what comes across to me is just that sense of giving the public the perspective, but also being respectful of people's well-being when you're out on the scene. And thankfully, I haven't had to go to too many actual fire scenes. You do a lot of reporting remotely, but when you do go out to, whether it's car crashes or any sort of emergency, you've really got to be mindful of those elements.
For sure. I'm thinking about how, as you raised, Rebecca, there are those questions about, you know, what are the ethics in this situation? And as you spoke about, Steph, how do you make that call about whether someone is in a place to be interviewed? Are there any, you know, if you make the call that someone isn't in a place to be interviewed, do you just go looking for another person who's living through the disaster, or are there other sources that you can go to in order to get quotes for your stories?
You could go to community leaders and also authorities, of course, who would usually coordinate a bit of a media opportunity for the press that are on the ground. And also to mention, some people will probably say to you when they're not fit to be interviewed as well. That's usually what happens more of the time when people say no and turn you down. You could maybe give them your business card, and then perhaps down the track they may feel more up for the chance to talk when they've had a bit more time to think about it and you're not putting them on the spot and they've recovered. But of course, I've had instances where people become emotional during interviews, and then you might need to follow up later and give them a call afterwards and just see how they're traveling and how they're feeling. But yeah, there are other sources to go to and ways around it, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that context can be helpful. You know, sometimes I find that people aren't sure if they want to talk, and you can see it in their face. Maybe they said yes, but you can see that they're really not that sure that they want to share their story right now, or, you know, their kid is running around and they're kind of distracted and they're like, sure, do you have some questions you want to ask me? Or maybe they're actively distressed, but they're adamant that they do want to talk. And even in that case, like making sure that you're speaking in a setting that feels safe, in a space where they're in control and can leave if they would decide to leave, and with other people around in some cases that can make them feel more comfortable and also make them feel like there's somebody on their side, because it can be very daunting to talk to a reporter, or, you know, in broadcast events, it's a whole team. If there's a camera or a microphone, you know, it can feel like one against many, and that is not a great way to tell, especially, you know, a really traumatic story. So like sometimes I'll run across somebody who's lived through something really hard and I want to know about it and they want to tell me about it. And I'll say, you know what, let's meet in an hour at this location, or let's, like, what are you doing this afternoon? Okay, so you're gonna go pick up water at the aid station. Like, let's do the interview there, and then I can be there. I can make sure that if there's somebody from the Red Cross who can sit in on the interview, or who can be available to provide anything that I find out about during the interview the person needs. Like, that can be a nice way to make sure that I'm not putting somebody in a situation that they wouldn't have gotten into if they had thought all the way through it, but they're too stressed to think all the way through it on their own.
Yeah, nice. That sort of thinking into trauma-informed interviewing techniques that allow for a story to emerge, but in a safe way. Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks. I guess we're sort of moving into that territory of thinking about the storytelling. I think there are ethical issues at the level of individual interviews, but there are those broader ethical issues at the level of storytelling, aren't they? And storytelling, of course, goes beyond the ethical issues. So, good reporting, it can contribute to our cultural understanding of what's happening in an emergency and what's happening to people who are experiencing an emergency. And of course, you guys have constraints. You're working in a newsroom or for a broadcaster. I wondered, given that, we've got a lot of interest from journalists who want to go into the space of reporting on emergencies. I wondered if you could talk a little bit, and we might start with you, Steph, talk a little bit about some of the constraints that you experience and how you work with those when you're out reporting on an emergency that's unfolding a lot of the time as you're there.
Well, I think in the past year, a lot of reporters have been thrown into the pandemic as a disaster. That's an emergency crisis that's been happening worldwide. So everyone's had a taste of that reporting experience. And I suppose the constraints for us there were access to medical professionals who were just so busy and weren't available for an interview because they're on the front line, even though their voices are really important to hear what is going on in hospitals and behind the scenes. And I guess we learned a bit more about aged care and how elderly people were treated and not having access to them as well. So in a sense, there were constraints in terms of getting two people face to face, but we also had Zoom and Skype and all these technologies that also opened up opportunities to get people heard who may not already be interviewed or not have the chance to speak. And that's been a great equalizer, I guess, for the media to get access to people remotely. And that can also be applied to people in natural disasters who you can't get to physically with a camera, but you're able to get them to record on their computer. And that's just been a good way to overcome that issue, I think.
Yeah, certainly a lot of creativity. I remember particularly, Steph, I wonder if you do, at the start of the lockdown in Melbourne, there was a series of stories that focused on people living with disability who themselves had long periods already of isolation. There's a really interesting thread of exploring the existing knowledge and understanding in a community about how to manage what was for the rest of the community a relatively new experience. You could see, I think, a story that I'd not seen told in the mainstream press before becoming a focus, really. I really appreciated that creativity that emerged. I'm wondering, Rebecca, if you have any thoughts about that. And those constraints, they can be productive, but they can also be sort of newsroom constraints, can't they? Like, editorially, you need to get this story or that footage or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that Steph has been under pressure on deadline, after the disaster and during an emergency. Often the people who are working in the newsroom are affected either emotionally or having forbid personally. And so there's also some of the stress that goes along with daily newsroom deadlines can get exacerbated if people are also juggling family concerns or worries about the safety or well-being of their loved ones. That's definitely come up with the pandemic as well. But one thing that, just in terms of solutions to that, because that, that's the state of news, and it's a very competitive space, and there will always be pressure to get more done faster, which is kind of in opposition to a lot of the things we've been talking about. So one thing that I've found that can be really helpful is just preparing when there isn't an emergency, thinking ahead. Emergencies are very repetitive. The same things happen over and over. And so you can think about what are the most important lenses that we need to bring into an emergency of this type. Who are the types of people who don't get hurt? Who are the types of people who suffer the most? Who are the people who end up winning at the end, come out richer or more powerful? Like, do we need to hold them accountable? And do some of that labor, some of that thinking ahead of time, do interviews ahead of time, read the research ahead of time, so that when you do get into that situation that you're under the gun and you have to file in 2 hours, and you only are going to get to do 3 interviews, and that doesn't feel like enough time to really be thoughtful, you can apply what you're hearing to bigger trends, and you can give context, and you can do stories that nod at the systemic without, requiring that you do all that research on the spot. And I think that can be really helpful. It's something that took me years to learn, that I could work on emergency reporting when there was no emergency, basically.
I feel like that's sort of pointing at that issue of ethics at the level of storytelling, isn't it? So asking questions about, and this came up definitely in the panel in the Diversity and Disaster Conference, who isn't being heard? What's the pressure to get a particular kind of story? And how do you make those choices when you yourself are under pressure? I feel like you also pointed, Rebecca, at the issue of recognising the impact that disasters might have on journalists. So first, they may be in the disaster themselves, or their loved ones may be in the disaster. But second, that the reporting on emergencies can also does have an impact on the journalists themselves. So just recognising that I've found the resources that DART produce really useful. I was wondering if either of you have any other thoughts about self-care and what journalists can do to recognise the impact that the story is having on them, on they themselves.
What do you think, Stephanie? I'm curious to know your perspective, because I wonder if it's different from the US at all.
Well, I think going back to the Melbourne lockdown, when we couldn't leave the house very much, you really were living and breathing the story, and you were having to report on coronavirus day in, day out. And at one stage, we only had 1 hour of exercise to do. So that's really hard to manage your well-being when you're pretty restricted in what activities you can do. So being an avid consumer of news, I do find it hard to turn off the television and turn away from those press conferences. But I think that's a really important thing to do, and try and maintain your activities that you enjoy, whether that's yoga or watching a TV show or playing with dogs, puppies, animals, which you've got the interest in too. That helps with my well-being for sure, getting access to pets. And yeah, look, I think also when you've been to a very traumatic situation, besides coronavirus, important to debrief with counsellors and the support that's on offer from your workplace, and talk to those professionals, because there may be some issues that come up later down the track that you're not thinking of and you're not aware of, and that's something you really need to follow up.
Yeah, that definitely all rings true to me. And I think, having a therapist it's simple, but it's something that I think any journalist who knows they're going to be covering emergencies should just do. Like, there's never a bad moment to get into a professional relationship with a therapist, and then you have that person ready, and it doesn't have to be something that you deal with when you're stressed. I also think, just say no to assignments when you know that you've been stretched thin. It's not always possible in our field, but I've been seeing more and more of my colleagues, if you are called out to cover a fire or a shooting or a hurricane, and then there's another one, and you're sent again, they say, can you go? Say no. And that's okay. You won't lose your job. And if you do lose your job, it wasn't a job you wanted. I think there was a culture for a long, long time of just grit your teeth and bear it. And I think that to some extent that's changing, but it only changes because people say, I'm not in the right headspace to do that. Can you assign someone else, please? And that tells the editor, oh, right, you have feelings and you're affected by the work you do.
I feel like we've been talking around the ways in which storytelling sort of unfolds, So there's the story that you want to tell, there's the story that's unfolding in front of you, there's recognition that you're a human as a journalist in that context. There's all of the ethics that you need to consider when you're moving in that space, both at the level of individual interactions, but also at the level of which stories you're choosing to tell and how you're interacting with the demands of your editors and newsrooms. I guess I wanted to pivot slightly now and ask a question about how you see gender informing the stories that you tell about emergencies and disasters. And I think, there's so many layers to this question, but I'd be really interested to understand what you see when you go out to emergencies and disasters, and whether you feel that's informed, whether you bring a gendered lens to that. Are you seeing different stories unfolding for women and men, and what that does to the storytelling that you do, and acknowledging I'm using that binary there in sort of an informed way. Of course, we know that there's much more happening for people beyond the binary than just how emergencies are impacting on women and men. We also know that binary is regularly used in the storytelling. Steph, that was a very long question. Do you want to bite off any chunk of that?
Yes, I will. Well, the media can only portray what society, what's reflected in society, right? So if there's certain gender roles that are coming up again and again, that's what the news coverage will display. And we know there are gender imbalances in certain positions of authority, and the narrative I'm seeing at the moment, particularly with the New South Wales floods, which has been the past week, is that families are overwhelmed, mothers are worried about their children. The men I'm seeing on SBS television and coverage there is that they're trying to assess damage, look after properties. That's the consistent role that's coming up, whereas the women have a different position to fulfill in those disasters. And there's kids, of course, on screen being reunited with their families. In the media, there is a woman in authority at the Weather Bureau who keeps popping up again and again, so it is good to show some women in those leadership positions that are giving out important information about rainfall and what's coming up in the forecast. And I've also seen men in rescue boats on SBS News. And so that's, I guess, coming back to men going into their duty and trying to help out. And of course, that's a similar theme you see in fire coverage as well, and lots of other disasters. So I think as a journalist, you just need to really think about the images you're seeing and challenge some of those assumptions and those stereotypes, and perhaps give the audience a different perspective. However, we're only really seeing a snapshot of what's going on the ground, because the media don't have access to absolutely everything that's happening. So we can really only cover what we've got access to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking there were two things that I was thinking about on this front, and that definitely dovetail with what you're saying, Stephanie. One is that here in the US, we have a sort of interesting thing that happens around hurricanes, specifically on the Gulf of Mexico, that I think is actually very similar to what I've seen in the Australian media around bushfires when it comes to that hero trope. And it's related to this group of, it's actually a group of men and women, but you would think it was just men who have boats, they have personal boats. They're called the Cajun Navy. That's the sort of catch-all term for them. And they show up in areas all along from Texas all the way over to Florida, and they help rescue people when it floods. And if you watch television, you would think that only men own and can drive boats in the Gulf of Mexico, which is not the case. And anyone who's covered it knows that there are a lot of women who are not just part of this, they're like central to the organization of this group that does a lot of rescuing. But it doesn't show up as much. And it's such a like interesting parallel in my mind to what I've seen with bushfire coverage, because wildfires are a little bit different here in the US in terms of how firefighters are portrayed. They're mostly, they're government employees for the most part. We have a whole thing with prisoners that I won't even get into that kind of undercuts the hero idea. But
Interesting.
But when it comes to these rescuers in boats, it's very similar to the sort of stories and narratives that you see unfolding with bushfires. And it just tells you how deep the gender roles are in all of our minds. Like we're reflecting the society that we live in every media hit. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's not that the reality has no women, it's that we're not seeing them.
That our storytelling is really skewed to reinforcing these pre-existing norms and stereotypes. I mean, I think both of those things are true, aren't they? That we see so much more of these reinforcing images and these reinforcing stories that are telling it, that are really colluding with that myth, as well as when you look again, or when you look without necessarily being caught up in those stereotypes, you see that there's a greater variance of stories to be told. So there's a question about how they're not coming through, how they're not rising to the surface. And again, I think that goes to the ethics of storytelling that we've sort of been talking about at that greater arc level. And one of those things that I think is we're really caught up with in storytelling, particularly in Australia, is this sort of overarching theme. It's really driving myth of resilience, and the way in which we use that word, the way in which we harness that concept to go to work for us to help with sending messages of hope or telling stories that end on a bit of an up note. I was wondering whether resilience has been something, I mean, both of you have been, in your work, have been involved over longer periods of time with communities post-disaster. So being engaged beyond just the moment of emergency. And again, we could have a long philosophical conversation about what that moment is in the context of climate change, but taking as a containment device for this interview that the emergency happens in a moment. You guys have both engaged with communities beyond that moment. I wondered if you had any reflections about the way in which resilience is sometimes harnessed in storytelling about emergencies, and also what you see over the longer term in communities as they grapple with the long tail of a disaster. Steph, I always come to you when I've asked a really long, complicated, multi-dimensional question.
That's all right.
Rebecca, do you want to take the hit for this one?
It's all you, Steph. You got it.
All right. I feel like my answer might be a bit shorter than the question, but look, I think communities often complain a lot here in Australia that you've got the media rushing in right after the emergencies happened. They want to get the interviews and talk to people, and then they'll leave, they'll flee, and communities are left still picking up the pieces. And often there isn't a lot of follow-up, and media don't necessarily go back and check on communities. So that's something I try and follow up and do myself in my reporting, and make sure I am going back and checking in and seeing have those grants been followed up, has the money come into communities, and making sure you are checking in. And yes, you're right, there is that element at the end of a news story. You want to give that message of hope and show that they're going to bounce back, and the Australian typical slogan of she'll be right and everyone's going to get on with it. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of cleanup to do and a lot of recovery, and people, yes, do need to be resilient, but they also need to have these issues exposed that are going on, some of the traumas that are deeper and do continue and linger, that the media really does need to portray and cover.
I feel like, Rebecca, some of the stuff that you were saying about the research and being able to think into emergencies even when an emergency is not on, I feel resilience, I think, is sometimes used to paper over the institutional failures that emergencies bring to light,
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. That rings very true to me. I think often the term resilience and the ideas around resilience, in my experience, are used to sort of suggest that the individuals who are suffering an acute problem that was brought on by an act of God, and that they are responsible for getting themselves out of. That a person who is resilient, or a community that's resilient, will rebuild from a cataclysm on their own. And there's no acknowledgement that, first of all, the cataclysm was not an act of God, it was an act of man. All disasters are man-made in some way, and that there are systemic failures that led to the people who are suffering the most, and that those systems are the systems that would need to be built differently, not just rebuilt, in order to prevent it from happening again. So I think, one thing I've thought about a lot as I report on disasters that unfold slowly over time, or follow up on an acute disaster that happened, is, how can we frame the whole story systemically? There are two ways to think about individuals in the story. I think one is to say, I'm going to interview a lot of individuals, and then I'm going to, from that, see a trend and illustrate that trend. And I actually prefer to do the other way, which is to say, how is society built? What can we say about what this disaster illuminated? What broken things in our society did this disaster shine a light on? And then let's do interviews and listen to people's experiences and put those experiences into that context so that they're a part of the bigger thing, if that makes sense. And I think that can be a sort of it's more honest. And I also think that it's more helpful to the population, because you're saying, like, it's not you. You don't have to just be strong. This is something that is collective and it's systemic, and we have to build it better if we want it to work better.
I think there's also something in resilience that relates to nation building, and I think it relates in this way. We do our acknowledgement of country when we start these interviews. We recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. We're both reporting in sort of settler colonial, each of you are reporting in settler colonial contexts. There's something about the resilience narrative that I think tries to build a story about what it is to be Australian, what it is to be American, in the context of this fight against the natural world, as though we're not deeply connected to the natural world, as though we're separate from it in some way. But also, as you pointed out, Rebecca, as though we're not intimately involved in creating the disaster in the first place. And for me, there's something in there around that nation building project that I think speaks to those bigger systems and themes. And we often see kind of pollies parading out, don't we, or during a disaster, sort of engaging with communities in ways that, as we've seen over the past couple of years with disasters where there's less of a gap, as the disasters and emergencies come one after the other, and our pollies are out there engaging in a conversation about what that means at the level of our national myth making. So speaking about myths, I wanted to, and this is really my last question for us today, I wanted to open the conversation up about some of the myths that are really present in the reporting, and draw down on that discussion that we had about gender stereotypes and how they might inform our reporting. And I note Rebecca, that you said that the firefighter myth is a bit different in the US. But if we use perhaps the firefighter myth here and then the Cuban Navy myth there, you know, thinking about these identities as almost a kind of sacred category. And here in Australia, you know, I think there's an echo in that myth between the myth of the Anzacs and the myth of the firefighters. But how do you deal with these really strong tropes that come through in storytelling, especially when we know from our research and the research that others have done that these myths can be particularly unhealthy for men? You know, that firefighters are, when they have to live up to that unrealistic myth of hypermasculinity, can experience some really poor health outcomes, and yet that trope is so easily available to us in our storytelling. And perhaps it's the Cuban Navy that's the parallel myth over there. Rebecca?
I think one sort of simple thing that I've run across is to tell stories that center women as decision makers in family structures. You know, it doesn't take a stretch to do that. Women often are the decision makers in family structures. And I think as soon as you start to acknowledge that that's something you're looking for your story, you know, I want to tell a story about a family. First of all, like, a family can be a group of people of sort of any organization. And I want to tell a story about a family that had an experience with the disaster. Like, I think what I'm looking for is a mother, or I'm looking for a woman who is caring for a group of people and making decisions about how to keep them safe, and just go from there. And like, men will end up in the story. They will, like, they have a way of getting into the story. And they may even end up in the story in roles that have power and decision-making power. But if you go in with the lens that, like, I think what I'm primarily looking for is a strong central woman, then I think that can help you not fall into the trap of oh, well, that guy's standing over next to the shelter and he's pretty loud and maybe I should interview him. And all of a sudden you've done the story that you knew you didn't want to do, but you did it anyway.
And I'll jump in if you like. I think at SBS, we're really trying to make a conscious effort to highlight different voices, so people from different cultural perspectives, and that's really important. With our charter, we're wanting to make sure people from diverse backgrounds are heard. But looking at the language we even use, you've got terms like gunman, fireman, spokesman, and they're just naturally the words that we use. So at SBS, we try and use the term spokesperson as an example. Even that's just a small thing, but in written online articles that can make a difference. And also we're big on First Nations people and trying to find out some of those community members, what roles are they doing? There might be a First Nations Indigenous firefighter who wants to talk to you. They might have a lot to say about cultural burning practices and some of the traditional works that are done in burn-offs and bushland, and how they have that relationship with country. So I guess that's a way to overcome the myth of a firefighter, because there might be an elder or a person in a senior Indigenous role that might be able to contribute to the conversation and give a different perspective that you may not have thought about before.
In what I can only call celestial intervention, there's a fire alarm going off at my house at the moment. So if you can hear that, it's next door, but if you can hear it, I apologise. Yeah, and I guess I think, thanks for those answers. I think they're terrific. I wondered if either of you had some thoughts about, you know, given we have these kind of sacred categories, given we have these categories that can be a little bit difficult to navigate our way around, you know, if we think about this at the level of the system, though, we also know that recent reporting in Australia is beginning to reveal some pretty significant discrimination against women in firefighting services, and that discrimination goes from everything from sort of everyday employment practice right through to sexual harassment and sexual assault. I was wondering if either of you have tried to navigate that space in your reporting. I know, Stephanie, you've done a lot of reporting on family violence and the failure of the systems. What are your strategies for engaging with some of these more difficult issues that really threaten that myth, basically, but are nonetheless really important system stories that are beginning to come to light? I know there was it's probably a decade ago now, but a Senate inquiry in the US or equivalent thereof into these kinds of issues in your own firefighting forces, Rebecca. What are the kinds of strategies that you employ to be able to tell some of these stories? And do you ever personally receive backlash or online abuse for covering these kinds of issues?
There's always commentary on social media, isn't there, that people like to throw out their perspectives, and they're entitled to their opinion, of course. I think you just need to treat these issues with respect and sensitivity, and it is a delicate balance. You're trying to get the different points of view in there, of course. You want to be impartial and accurate and check your facts. So I think approaching it in such a way as if someone's defensive and you're just wanting to let them know that this is their opportunity to respond, give their point of view. If they don't believe the other person's opinion of the other side of the story, then you need to emphasise to them that this is their chance to respond. And if they don't, then it's going to be silence in the article and they won't have that opportunity to comment. So yes, of course, there's always people that come back and don't agree with what you're saying. But yeah, it's really important as a reporter to think beyond the status quo and go beyond those norms. And as you say, if there are harassment or sexual assault allegations, airing those and making sure that the victims and the survivors do have a voice.
Thanks, Steph. Rebecca?
Yeah, I think one thing that I found to be very helpful is, there are stories that must be done and that are really important that focus on those issues, where the story itself is about discrimination, it's about harassment, it's about the lack of diversity, even stories that are about sort of systemic bias. Those are really important stories. But there are also a much larger volume that's reaching a much larger audience of stories they're about the news, they're about a disaster or emergency that just happened and the people who were affected or are responding. And every single one of those stories is an opportunity to drop in a line, especially when there is a little bit of movement and there are official sources on these things. It's actually the same approach I take to climate change in general. Every single story like that should say, the earth is getting hotter, remind people. And also, if there is something like that at play, so let's say you interviewed a firefighter and it's a guy because there were only guys there, like maybe there's a place for a line there that says, a Senate inquiry last year found that there's widespread discrimination and harassment within the fire service. And you just move on. Like it's not central to the story, but it should be there so that people hear it. And when they think about that topic, they think about that element of that topic. And it starts to worm its way into the public consciousness, or at least that's my hope.
Thank you. Those are really all my questions, and we're close to time, but I wondered if there was anything that either of you had a question about or wanted to leave the audience with a question, or anything that you feel like I didn't get to that you'd like to contribute.
Well, Steph, I have just a very quick question. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this and how it's unfolding in Australia. Here in the US, I think we're at a huge inflection point on these issues of resilience. The entire economy was tanked by the pandemic. This is the first time in a long time there's been somebody in the White House who is interested in large-scale infrastructure change. And so the words around resilience and building back and what it means to be more resilient. That is like central to what the American experience is right now politically. And I wonder, like, in light of what Australia has gone through with the fires, with the pandemic, are you seeing a similar inflection point or no?
Yeah, I'd say so. There's a lot of emphasis on the economy being resilient, bouncing back, people getting back to work. And yes, because we have had that combination of fires and we've had the pandemic basically back to back, there's a lot of people that are really struggling. And I think that there's a lot of damage that's been done, and there is that focus on people recovering. And we're very lucky now, we don't really have any community transmission apart from a small lockdown happening in Brisbane at the moment in the north of the country. So of course the pandemic's still going, but yeah, there's a lot of focus on people travelling again. That's come up today in the news. So the politicians are trying to encourage tourists to get out and see the country again. And yeah, we are in that rare position where we're an isolated island and we've got that protection. So there's a lot of support for nationalism and people seeing your own backyard and getting into different states and supporting the economy that way.
Interesting. I just think a lot of these issues we talked about feel very, very present in my work in a way that they hadn't even felt last year, for example, or the year before. So very timely, Naomi.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we really look to do with the conference is to ensure that we're trying to have some conversations about these ideas in ways that mean that we leave some tools lying around that can easily be picked up, that we can make a contribution to what might be happening in this flexion point. Recognising that resilience can also be true of things that aren't great, like we know that lots of really unhelpful systems like that have caused the disasters that we're experiencing are incredibly resilient, which might be a great place to stop. Thank you so much, both of you, and each of you for your contributions to today's conversations. We're going to sign off now, and we look forward to hearing more from many more thinkers across the conference as we contemplate where we're headed with gender and emergencies in the current context. So thanks to both of you, and we look forward to the conference unfolding over the next 1 to 6 weeks. Thanks a lot.